Welcome to the third lecture for Unit 1. This lecture is the maturity of colonial America, but also a story of imperial integration in which the colonies and Britain become more tightly bound together. In the beginning of this period, roughly the 1660s, there's a founding of new colonies, mostly by grants of land to individual groups of men. We call them proprietors. Essentially, they're businessmen, and they get land for some kind of services to the king or as a favor from the king. And the property is given to them in colonial America so they can turn a profit. So they're businessmen. Many of them have very grand visions of what they want to take place in colonial America. So they go with all these dreams in their heads about how they want the area to look, how their colony should look. The Carolinas, for example, are granted to 8 lords proprietors who attempt to create a feudal society. They write a very elaborate constitution that creates essentially serfs and barons and nobles. It's a total failure. It doesn't work. Pennsylvania is established as a haven for Quakers. So the vision there is religious freedom and toleration for William Penn and those like him. Interestingly enough, it actually does work. So the Quakers establish a colony that grants relative sexual equality, meaning that women, at least in religious terms, are seen as roughly equal to men with equal rights to speak in church and to participate in church business. The Quakers are pacifist, which works out fairly well at the beginning, but not so much later. And they tend to dislike slavery, which is going to make them sort of out of sync with the rest of America by the 1770s. What makes Pennsylvania work is its religious toleration. So it's not just for Quakers, but anybody with any religious background can come there. There's open welcoming of all different faiths. It's a very diverse place to live. Lots of different groups of people, Germans and Swedes and English people. It is a place of cities. The city, in fact, is Pennsylvania, which is the largest city in America up until 1800. And one of the reasons it's also successful is because it's the breadbasket of America. The production of wheat and grain here enables Pennsylvanians to turn a profit by selling grain, surplus grain, to other places that don't grow their own food, such as the Caribbean. Georgia is relatively late in this story of proprietary colonies. It's created as a haven for debtors. It's got a very explicit set of plans for how they want Georgia to turn out. Originally, those plans included no slavery at all until the settlers there complained, saying we need slaves in order to compete with South Carolina. One of the underlying reasons for the founding of Georgia, too, was that it would be a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. It would sort of protect the Carolinians from the Spaniards and Indian raids on the coast there. So these are the new colonies formed between 1660 and 1730. Map-wise, we can see them here. You've got the Carolinas down here in the south. Pennsylvania, middle colonies here. Maryland we didn't mention specifically here, but that's granted to the Calvert family as a haven for Catholics. And then Georgia down here in the bottom. This map shows, interestingly enough, the different immigrant groups that end up settling in colonial America. You can see this yellow portion here, this sort of orangey yellow, is all English and Welsh people. But we've got very large influxes in, say, Philadelphia of Germans, Scots-Irish, Dutch in New York, Africans in blue, thanks to the institution of slavery, Scots-Irish on the frontier. Overall, by about 1770, 49% of colonial Americans will be of an English descent. You can see this broken down in this graph. I wouldn't memorize these statistics, but they just show you the thousands of settler groups that come to colonial Americas. Notice, for example, that the West Indies has some of the largest influxes of European Americans because they're much more profitable, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment. Large population of Africans as well, thanks to slavery. Whereas the South is probably the next largest in terms of peoples who go there. And then the Mid-Atlantic and New England are relatively small settlements overall, not as profitable, but then again, there are also places where people are coming for religious diversity and religious freedom, and not necessarily money making. In the 1660 to 1700 time period, there's also quite a number of revolts and political instabilities. And I used to ask an essay question about comparing these revolts because it seemed just strange that there'd be so many revolts within such a limited time frame. And several of them have to do with Indians. So you kind of wonder if there's a connecting thread between them. And just recently, Sir Jeffrey Parker at Ohio State has written a book called Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century. And he's shown, in many ways, some of the instabilities of the 1660 to 1700 time period is due to environmental conditions. There is a little ice age, which makes growing season shorter, food supplies scarcer, environmental conditions worse. We've seen already Bacon's Rebellion falls in this time period, King Philip's War falls in this time period, the Salem Witchcraft Trials fall in this time period, and each of those has its own sort of underlying causes about Indian relationships, young British guys coming to America trying to make names for themselves, conflict over witches and different halves of the Salem town. Other revolts include the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, in which the Indians overthrow the Spanish for 10 years. So notice that's within 5 years of King Philip's War, 4 years of Bacon's Rebellion. It's about 12 years before Salem Witchcraft Trials. What caused the Pueblo Revolt? In many ways, it's similar to Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War, in that Indians are upset over their working conditions. They're upset over Catholicism and their mistreatment by Catholics. And you can see that in the revolt itself. The Indians, for example, force a friar to ride naked on a pig through the streets and then stab him through the heart. In other places, they urinate and defecate on the sacramental elements of the altar. So there's a lot of anti-Catholic tension there. 1688 is a glorious revolution which has its origins in political revolution in England, particularly the fact that the English king is becoming increasingly Catholic. And the fear is that he will return the country to Catholicism. So the English overthrow their monarch and replace him with a Dutch guy, William of Orange, whose wife is an English princess. The result of this glorious revolution is a reestablishment of the political and religious liberty of the English people through the adoption of sort of English Bill of Rights, some constitutional guarantees for their freedoms, and a definite, we're not going back to Catholicism. In colonial America, there's a parallel revolt, a series of revolts going on in Maryland, in New England, New York. And these revolts are by colonists who don't like their British governors. So they look at England and they go, well, England's revolting, why can't we revolt? And in 1701, there is the end of probably more than 40 years of war between the French and the Iroquois, various Iroquois factions. This era of wars is known as the Beaver Wars. A lot of it's for competition over furs. The French have allies among different groups of Indian peoples that they're trying to convert to Catholicism. And then finally the conflict comes to an end just as the Little Ice Age is coming to an end. What happens in this grand settlement is the creation of a middle ground. The French become the father, metaphorically speaking, to the Indians, or Onuntio. And this metaphorical fatherhood puts the French in a position of the keeper of peace between various Indian groups. You know, if there are conflicts between rival tribes or nations, the French mediate these issues. So we get a long series of revolts and riots that Sir Geoffrey Parker says may be due underlyingly to environmental changes associated with the Little Ice Age, where harvests are shorter and people's tempers are more likely to flare. Here's the French middle ground, where the French are trying to work out with different groups of Indians resettlement and protection, especially in the wake of attacks by the Iroquois. The Iroquois live mostly here, and they were attacking these groups of Indians to try to get access to furs, so then they could sell them to the Dutch and the English as well as the French. So we see here another illustration of the Columbian Exchange, in which European involvement in the New World generates trade, but it also makes Indian warfare more frequent and more deadly. Now, for the most profitable colonies in colonial America, the Caribbean, the West Indies. These colonies received the bulk of migrants from Europe and Africa. These colonies were the most profitable because they manufactured sugar. Sugar was a highly sought-after product in Britain, and its production was particularly brutal, leading to an increased demand for African slaves. Pretty much in the West Indies, you would have to replace your entire workforce, your entire slave workforce, about every 10 years because of the brutality of the sugar regime. And that meant that the West Indies developed a very strong sense of how to regulate and govern slaves very early on in the 1640s. And these race-based slave codes eventually do make their way to the Americas, particularly South Carolina. Chesapeake, that is Virginia and Maryland, have tobacco. That's their saving grace, as we've already discovered. And there, it's still brutal, but not quite as brutal as sugar. The brutality is largely in the fact that they work in a gang system. you take a group of slaves, 10 to 15 slaves, they become a work gang, and they work all day, sun up to sundown, without hardly any rest, weeding, picking, hoeing, you name it, planting. By 1770, 60% of all Virginians own a slave. So slavery is going to be widespread throughout colonial Virginia society. You can't go anywhere in colonial Virginia without seeing slavery involved in social, political, and economic relations. In South Carolina, which is settled in many ways largely by people from the Caribbean, particularly Barbados, they are focused on the production of rice. And rice is a little bit easier in the sense that for long portions of time, you have to just leave rice alone. Let it sit in the field, and people have to harvest it later. And that means that they evolved something called a task system, in which slaves are given a task. Once they're done, they have free time. So slaves in South Carolina have time to grow gardens, take on other odd jobs. They become expert navigators and sailors. Some of them become carpenters and blacksmiths because of more free time. That also means that they can cause trouble or get into trouble. So, for example, in 1739, there was a revolt of about 100 of these slaves who were trying to make their way to Spanish Florida, where they heard that you could get your freedom if you got to Florida. And so they killed a whole bunch of white people, didn't make it, and South Carolina responded with tougher slave laws in order to clamp down on this system. As much as possible, wherever slaves were, they tried to retain their culture and their customs, which is difficult when you're being worked all day. You're being thrown together with just different groups of people, don't speak your language or share your traditions. But to whatever extent you can, you're creating a new culture and saving as much as you know of your old way of life. Here is the West Indies colonies, so Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados, St. Vincent, all these, Martinique, places where sugar is widely grown. The French own some of these, the British own some of these, the Dutch, and then the Spanish own them. So just a mixture of European possessions here. This map shows slavery's victims from Africa. Particularly this area right here, the Bight of Biafra, is where you will find most slaves coming from. They will, in large numbers, end up in the Caribbean and in Brazil. So 2 million, 3 million. Relatively few slaves end up in the Americas. 26,000 go to the north, 127,000 Chesapeake, 143,000 to the Carolinas and Georgia. So the largest consumer of slaves is actually the Caribbean and South America, which is something we typically tend to forget. And that's because the kind of slavery that gets created here in Americas becomes so brutal and becomes so in distinction to American political culture, the idea America is a land of the free, and then yet we've got the slavery in the midst. So we tend to focus on the Americas, even though it's not got the largest numbers overall. As you might have learned in previous classes, it's a particularly brutal system. The goal is putting as many people on a boat as possible, cramming them in a roughly 4x4 space where they will urinate and defecate on each other. If your neighbor gets sick that you're chained to, oops, probably going to die, because there's just not that sense of taking care of your humans, your human property. So if you're very sick, they'll probably just throw you overboard. The goal is to get to the Americas with many of them as possible, so that you can sell them and make money. So it's a system that's brutal and just dehumanizes people down to objects. You can see here an illustration drawn much later in the 1780s to show how slave ships tried to stack as many people as possible on board the ship. Whippings and brutal punishments were common, particularly if the slaves came from the Congo, which most colonial people did not like Congolese slaves because they were seen as much more unruly and harder to discipline. Slaves are in every single part of colonial America, so don't get in the habit of thinking, oh, well, the North just never had any. Nope. Even New Hampshire, 1% of New Hampshire's population was slaves. New York, 11%. And then in places like Rhode Island, for example, only 6.5%. But Rhode Island is actually one of the key starting points for the slave trade. These northern ports is where boats would sail out of with, say, rum to sell in Africa, where they pick up slaves, go to the Caribbean, sell slaves, pick up sugar, go back to Rhode Island. So not as many enslaved peoples, but still strongly connected to this institution of making money off of human property. And of course, predictably, the South, very high rates, including South Carolina. More slaves in South Carolina than white people. And there's just a map to remind you where all these places are. Sugar is particularly brutal in the Caribbean. And this is just an illustration of people feeding the cane through a system to crush the cane so they can produce the sugar. Hot, dirty, dangerous work. So it consumes humans in a particularly brutal way. Here's tobacco, the plant, and then rice production in the South. Two of the other products that used slave labor. Here is a sugar plantation in Antigua with slaves cutting down the cane. Cane is very tall and very tough to cut, so it requires round-the-work labor in order to even cut the plant and then to process it through the crusher, so you could produce the juice that would be boiled to make sugar. Here's an example of African culture surviving in colonial America. This is a drum that shows African design and illustrates the fact that Africans retain their musical traditions in the Americas with a particular emphasis on rhythm. Rhythm was more important in African music than melody or even harmony. You don't see a lot of harmony in African music. And much of the music is for dancing, war dancing, and that sort of thing. Another African musical instrument is the banjo, brought to colonial America as well. And this painting showing Africans dancing, making music, a drum. This is perhaps a marriage ceremony. This couple may have been getting married and getting ready to jump the stick or jumping the broom. Here's just a great chart of the demography and ethnicity of the different regions of colonial America, showing you when they are, when they attain a black majority, what their economy is based off of. So this might be a really great review tool if you're trying to think about the regions as a whole rather than individual colonies. In order to make money off of colonial America, which is what the English wanted to do, they developed a very loose set of principles that historians have called mercantilism. Not actually really a thing. Economists, historians really invented this term much later. The English were never organized enough to have all of this written down as an actual set of governing principles. They just knew they wanted to make money off the colonies. And the assumption was that nations should import less and export more. If you buy less than you sell, you're going to generate a surplus of money. And the only way to really do that is to have colonies, because then you can exploit the colonies for their relative poverty to make yourself richer. What I mean by that is that the colonies were producers of raw products that would be cheaper, and in exchange for those raw products, you would sell them manufactured goods, which would be more expensive. So the colonies would be largely in debt to Britain. And in doing so, this would increase national wealth for the British against their competitors, say the French or the Spanish. To make this system work, the British came up with a series of navigation acts between 1651 and 1696. The acts were an attempt to regulate trade with the colonies, and the first set of acts forced the colonies to trade only with England using English ships, and even spelling out that the 3/4 of the crew had to be English. So it would force colonists to have a trade relationship with their mother country. And you'd be thinking, well, why wouldn't they? Well, actually, in early colonial America, they traded with anyone and everyone who would stop by with products they wanted. So colonial Virginians traded extensively, in fact, with the Dutch. Colonists were also, under these acts, forbidden to make products that they're expected to buy. So if the colonists wanted to, for example, make iron, once they discovered supplies of iron ore, they were told that they couldn't do that, or couldn't make paper, or couldn't make anything else that they're expected to purchase from England. Colonists, in the end, are driven to trade and make money the best way they know how, and sometimes that just means bending the rules or smuggling goods. That is, not following the Navigation Acts, trading with other people when you're not supposed to, hiding what you've been trading so that the British Navy doesn't see it. And they do this within a triangular trade system. That means that they're not trading only with England. They're trading with other places as well. And it's quite complex, and I'll show you a map. Eventually, after about 1700, the British decide that they're not going to enforce these trade regulations very strictly as long as they continue to make enough money from the colonies. And we call this the period of salutary neglect, which basically just means healthy or benign neglect, leaving the colonies alone as long as Britain continues to make enough money to make the colonies profitable. And they do. The reason they do is that the colonists become ever eager to buy British goods, to buy to buy materials produced in England, because they value English goods and English culture very strongly. We call this Anglicization. It's a deep attempt to imitate British culture by saying whatever the fashionable thing is in England, we must have it as colonial Americans. And if the English are reading a certain book, then colonial Americans want to read that book. If a certain fabric is popular, the colonial Americans want that fabric. And this imitation leads the colonists to actually go deeply into debt, buying English furniture, buying English wood, importing enough material to even build houses that are imitation of English homes. So England eventually tightens her grip on the colonies, ironically, by loosening the grip, by letting go of the colonies, and the colonies come to trade and love England more because they want to buy things from the British. So let's look at this trade and how it works out. First of all, raw goods go from the colonies. Raw goods like tobacco, indigo, flour, and lumber go to Great Britain. They're supposed to. The British sell manufactured goods back to the colonists. The British also trade with the West Indies, and they trade things like manufactured goods in exchange for molasses and sugar, which the British love. But the colonies are also trading with Spain and Portugal. One thing they love is Spanish wine, and they need salt. So they're getting that from Spain. In exchange, the Spanish are buying colonial dried smoked fish. The South Carolinians trade rice with the Spanish. Colonists also trade slaves for rum from Africa. Africans will buy colonial rum in exchange for slaves. This trade also extends to the West Indies, where slaves would be sold there to produce sugar, which would be then taken to New England to make the rum to buy the slaves. And there's even a trade between the colonial mainland, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, as well as the West Indies. The West Indies don't grow their own food, and they don't have their own forests for boiling the rum, because they've cut down all the trees to plant sugarcane. So they have to buy food and lumber from colonial America. And of course, Great Britain trades directly with Africa as well. So this system forms a rough triangle. It's not exactly triangular. It's not as if we only move in a triangular direction. But we kind of do. So what are the colonies producing? Well, in New England, the top produce, the top item that's sold is actually fish. And fish would be dried and smoked and sold to Spain. It would be sold to the Caribbean to feed slaves to grow the sugar, to then be sold to New England to make the rum. In the middle colonies, they grow grain mostly, which would be sold to the Caribbean to feed the slaves, to grow the sugar, to sell the sugar to New England, to make the rum, to go to Africa to buy the slaves. The Chesapeake is growing mostly tobacco in terms of value, which would be sold in Europe in order for Virginia planters to be able to afford their nice British outfits and British educations and British housing. And, as you probably could guess, the South is rice. When you map out the distribution of trade, you will find that New England and the colonies as a whole get only 80% of their goods, 80% of their trade value from Britain. And they only send 56% of the value to Britain, which leaves them greatly in debt, right? 80 to 56 is a big gap. They're instead trading very largely with the West Indies. The West Indies are sending 18% of their trade to the colonies, but the Americas are sending 26% of their trade to the West Indies. And then relatively little to Africa, but a large bit to Southern Europe, 18%. But only 2% of the trade distribution coming back. So the colonists are not in an exclusive relationship. They're not going steady with England, economically speaking. They're trading with all these other partners as well to make this system work, which is why it's kind of roughly a triangle if you map it out. What you will eventually see in colonial America as these developments continue is growing income inequality. So the richest over time become richer, starting with 46% of the wealth, and eventually by 1771 ending up with 63% of the wealth, and the poorest holding less wealth over time. So income inequality increases as colonial America grows and develops. You'll see this more true for northern port cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, but also in some places like Charleston, which Charleston has the wealthiest people in colonial America overall. This painting shows two interesting things. It's a Rhode Island family, and they're wearing their nice British clothes, but they're also drinking tea out of these cups that they probably bought from Britain. But interestingly enough, it's Rhode Island, and there's a slave in the picture, reminding you that colonial America was a place that depended on inequality in order for these folks to have the fine, leisurely life, the elite life that they wanted. One of the really great examples of Anglicization in the 1730s and 1740s is religious, and it is known as the Great Awakening. It originates in England, comes to the Americas, and it is Protestant Christians, not Catholics, but Protestant Christians, who become convinced that God is moving in their midst to bring lots and lots of people into the church. Coming from England is a minister named George Whitefield, is how you say his last name. So he's a transatlantic preacher who comes to the Americas and preaches, goes back to England, comes back to the Americas, and he represents, this Anglicization of, what's cool in England. Oh, revival? Well, we want that to be cool here. What he brings to this revival experience is an emphasis on personal conversion, an emphasis on you having a personal relationship with God. It's heavily emotional in that the services that they have grown men weeping because they are afraid that they will spend eternity in hell. One of the American sermons is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards, and it sort of casts this image that all humankind is hanging by a slender thread over the fiery flames of hell, and only God's mercy keeps you from falling into that pit. But God is angry, and He won't be merciful forever. So you should give your life over to Him while you still can. More women than men experience conversion in this experience, so you will see a lot more women, but you do see guys talking about it. I've read accounts from the 1730s of guys going to these services and crying for days on end because they're afraid for their souls. It's more successful in the north. Places with large cities are able to see a lot more attention on the revivals than rural places are. And Whitefield can draw more attention in a city than he can in the countryside. So that happens more in the north than it does in the south. It does create some conflict. And the conflict is between people who are old-fashioned and don't like the revivals and people who are very much in love with the revivals. We call them new lights and old lights. New lights meaning, yay, I like the revivals. Ooh, I'm excited. Love you, Whitefield. Woo! I mean, Whitefield's like a rock star to them. Old lights are curmudgeonly, and they're like, I don't like that Whitefield. I like the old-fashioned way, and my old preacher, and my old church. And I like somebody ripping into town and stirring everybody up and then whipping on out. So people actually split churches. They get into such fights over Whitefield and these revivals that the churches break apart. Pretty nasty breakups, in fact. This leads to many people rejecting authority, particularly the authority figures of the established churches. You know, church members start questioning whether or not their pastors know Jesus or not, and whether or not that their pastors can be trusted on spiritual matters. There are public fights over these ministry issues of whether or not a guy has a right to come into town and start ministering and whipping up the crowd, or is that the job of the local pastor? This also helps increase religious diversity in colonial America, in that more people who are inclined toward Baptists, Methodists, and other groups are also welcome to get involved in these revivals. So you see interdenominational mixing going on and the growth of these other churches as the revivals spread. And you also see new colleges. Colonial America wants its own ministry, its own ministers, and you're going to need a college to train them. So many of the colleges we associate today with the Ivy League experience are in fact religious institutions. Princeton, for example, is for training Presbyterians. Brown for training Baptists. And so these schools are created to train more people for the ministry. We call the entire experience the Great Awakening, or the First Great Awakening. There is going to be a second one later when we get to that, but that's going to be 100 years from this point. Here is the Reverend George Whitefield, who was cross-eyed, so his nickname was the Reverend Dr. Squintum. Here he is, his squinty self again. And a lot of people accused him of preaching for money. This sounds familiar in our day and age. A lot of people thought he was just an act. He was just a showman. He wasn't sincere or, honest. Women swooned because apparently he could make you cry just by saying the word Mesopotamia. Benjamin Franklin once reported that he went to hear Whitefield speak, and he said he wasn't going to give any money, and then by the end of the presentation, Franklin emptied out his pockets and was weeping, and then went up to Whitefield and said, "Hey, I have a business proposal for you. We could make some money off this." Here's a chart showing the major religious groups. We don't know how many people, we just know how many churches for colonial America. So Anglicans, about 406 churches by 1780, Baptists 457. The largest is Congregational or Puritan, Presbyterian 495 at the next largest. And then smaller smattering of other groups as well, Catholic, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, Lutheran. In the ultimate example of Anglicization, the colonial Americans really imitate English politics, and they try to consciously recreate the political culture of England in America. One historian, Jack Green, has called it political mimesis, miming English traditions, English law, English structures. In colonial America, the representative of England would be the governor, the royal governor, who would stand for and encourage the British policy, the British way. He typically had the power to call the assembly and send the assembly home if he didn't like what they were up to. But typically they had the power to pay him, which meant that if you had a bad British governor, he probably wouldn't get a paycheck. There's a North Carolina governor, for example, who didn't get a paycheck for 11 years because the assembly hated him. The lower assemblies, which we would think of today as like a House of Representatives, acted like mini parliaments. They fiercely guarded their power over taxation and lawmaking. They were intent on controlling politics in the colonies and protecting their liberties. Unlike England, more people in colonial America could vote because the ability to own land was far easier in the colonies than it was in England. One of the advertisements for Pennsylvania, for example, said that it was the best poor man's country. And that meant that a lot of colonial Americans really strongly, fiercely guarded their rights of Englishmen. They all knew this bundle of rights that all Englishmen had, that they didn't give up just because they'd gone to colonial America. Rights with juries, rights about taxation, rights about voting. Very rights-conscious people. Women, on the other hand, didn't have any political rights, though they were in some ways better off in colonial America than England. Women, according to English law, which was the same in colonial America, were under coverture, which is a doctrine that basically says that a woman is the political child of her husband. That a woman basically has no identity legally other than that of her husband himself. So political culture in the colonies, in many ways, was illustrative of Anglicization, even as it was slightly different, and there were some differences there. Differences which will come to be magnified in our next unit. Here's an illustration of Anglicization as well as politics. This is the governor's mansion, the governor's palace in Williamsburg, which you can still tour today. It's modeled very much on English design and was supposed to illustrate the power and the might of the English crown.